What happens when a racist thug targets the wrong black woman and her dog, thinking they're powerless to fight back? This is the gripping story of a determined dog owner who refuses to let injustice stand after her beloved pet is brutally attacked. From a harrowing confrontation in the park to a high-stakes courtroom showdown, watch as justice is served and resilience triumphs over cruelty. You won't believe how it all unfolds. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting golden light over the park as Nia Carter strolled with Max by her side. Max's tail wagged happily, his leash loose in her hand as they meandered along the winding path. The familiar scent of fresh grass mingled with the distant laughter of children playing, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. This walk was their daily ritual, a chance to unwind and forget about deadlines and responsibilities. Nia smiled as Max paused to sniff a patch of flowers, his nose twitching with curiosity. "Come on, buddy," she coaxed, gently tugging the leash. "Let's finish the loop before dinner." Max let out a soft bark, his ears perking up as if to say he agreed. Just ahead, a figure loitered near a bench, his posture slouched and his gaze sharp. Nia instinctively straightened, her grip tightening on Max's leash. The man, in his late 20s, wore a stained hoodie and scuffed boots, his expression hard and unwelcoming. As Nia approached, his eyes locked on her, his lips curling into a sneer. "Out for a stroll, huh?" he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. His eyes flicked to Max. "Fancy dog for someone like you." Nia hesitated, her stomach knotting, but she kept her voice calm. "Just getting some fresh air," she replied, trying to pass him. The man scoffed, but his glare lingered. "Fresh air? Yeah, sure. Walk your dog like nothing happened." Nia frowned, confused but cautious. "What are you talking about? You people think you can do whatever you want," he said, his voice rising. "Walk through my neighborhood like it's yours. Last month, I got evicted because of your kind moving in and raising rents. Now I'm stuck here, and you're out here flaunting it?" She froze, her grip on Max's leash tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I don't have anything to do with that." "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "You're all the same. Come in, drive us out, and act like it's no big deal. Think you're better than me, huh?" He stepped closer, his posture shifting into something more menacing. "Look," she said, her voice firm, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just walking my dog." The man laughed bitterly. "Trouble? You're the one bringing trouble. You don't even belong here." His eyes flicked to Max, who growled softly, his ears flattening against his head. "And this mutt, look at him, acting all tough, just like his owner." "Let's just go, Max," Nia said, her heart racing as she tried to steer Max away. But the man stepped forward, blocking their path. "You think you can just walk away?" His tone grew harsher, his face twisting with anger. "Maybe it's time someone reminded you this isn't your park." His gaze dropped to Max, "And I know just how to start." Nia's breath caught as Jared shifted his weight, stepping closer. Max growled louder, his body tense at her side. The man's sneer deepened, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "You know," Jared said, his voice dripping with menace, "you've got something I need. People like me, we don't get second chances. You all take everything. Jobs, housing, respect. I'm tired of losing." "I don't have anything to do with that," Nia replied, her voice steady despite the tremor building in her chest. "Just let us go." "Oh, you'll give me something, all right." He jabbed a finger toward her. "How about that fancy wallet in your pocket?" Or, his gaze dropped to Max, and a sinister grin spread across his face. "Maybe the mutt gets it instead." Nia's heart raced as her hand instinctively dropped to Max's leash, her fingers tightening around it. "Don't you dare touch him," she said, her voice rising with anger. Jared chuckled, a low, mocking sound that sent a shiver up her spine. "What's the plan, lady? You gonna fight me over a dog? Let's see if you care more about your cash or that mutt." Max barked sharply, his protective instincts kicking in. The sound echoed through the park, drawing the attention of a jogger in the distance who paused briefly before continuing on. Jared noticed the fleeting glance, but dismissed it, his focus fixed entirely on Nia. I don't have any money on me, Nia said, forcing her voice to remain calm. And I'm not giving you anything. That's so? Jared said, his voice hardening. Then maybe I'll take what I want. Before Nia could respond, Jared lunged forward. Instinctively, she stepped back, keeping herself between him and Max. Her free hand shot out, shoving Jared away with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. "Back off!" she shouted, her voice ringing with fury. Max barked again, his teeth bared as he strained against the leash. Jared staggered, but quickly regained his balance, his face twisting with rage. "You think you're tough, huh? I'll show you what tough looks like." His hand darted toward Max's leash, but Nia yanked it away just in time, adrenaline surging as she turned and bolted down the path. "Come on, Max!" she shouted, her voice breaking with urgency. Max ran at her side, limping slightly, but determined to keep pace. Behind them, Jared's voice bellowed with fury. "You can't outrun me! You hear me? You're not getting away!" His pounding footsteps echoed through the park, closing the distance as Nia and Max raced toward safety. The wind stung Nia's face as she sprinted down the park path, her pulse pounding in her ears. Max kept pace beside her, his gait uneven but determined. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as her mind raced just as fast. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Jared barreling after them, his face contorted with rage. "You can't run forever!" Jared shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Nia's hand trembled as she fumbled with her phone, her thumb swiping to unlock it. Come on," she muttered under her breath. She barely slowed her pace, her eyes darting between the path ahead and the phone in her hand. She managed to dial 911, pressing the phone to her ear as she pushed her legs to move faster. The operator's calm voice crackled through the line, a stark contrast to the chaos around her. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" "There's a man chasing me," Nia panted, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "He attacked me and my dog. He's trying to hurt us." "Ma'am, are you in a safe location?" the operator asked. "No, I'm running through the park," Nia replied, her voice quaking. "He's right behind me. Please, send someone now. Stay on the line with me." "Can you describe the man?" Nia glanced back again, her heart lurching as she caught sight of Jared closing the distance. His face was flushed with exertion, his teeth bared in a snarl. "White male, late 20s, she gasped. "Hoodie, jeans, brown hair. He's chasing us. Officers are on their way. Keep moving if you can, and try to stay in well-lit areas." Nia's grip on Max's leash tightened as she veered onto a busier path, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might intervene. But the park seemed emptier with each passing second, as if the world had conspired to leave her alone in this nightmare. "Hey!" Jared's voice boomed, louder and closer. "You think the cops will save you? They won't do a damn thing." His taunts sent a fresh jolt of fear through Nia's veins, but she refused to stop. She glanced over her shoulder once more, the sight of his furious expression propelling her forward. "Please hurry," she begged into the phone. "He's getting closer." Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she didn't dare slow down. Max stumbled slightly, letting out a soft whine, and Nia's heart ached at the sound. "Almost there, Max," she whispered, though she wasn't sure where "there" even was. Nia's lungs burned as she sprinted, her feet pounding against the pavement. Max whimpered slightly, but kept moving, his loyal determination pulling him forward, even with the limp in his stride. She couldn't slow down, not now. Every instinct screamed for her to get away, to put as much distance as possible between them and the maniac chasing them. But the pounding of Jared's footsteps grew louder, his taunts cutting through the park's eerie quiet, like a blade. "You think you can run from me?" Jared roared, his voice echoing around them. "You can't hide, and no one's coming for you." Nia glanced back, dread rising in her throat. Jared was closing the gap, his face flushed with rage, his strides long and deliberate. Her fingers fumbled for her phone again, the operator's voice still faintly audible in her ear. "Ma'am, stay on the line," the operator instructed calmly. Officers are en route. He's catching up! Nia panted, her words sharp and frantic. Please, tell them to hurry. We've dispatched officers to your location, the operator reassured her. Stay as calm as you can. Calm. The word felt meaningless as she turned her head to see Jared just a few strides behind. Max let out another strained bark, his limp worsening with every step. Nia's heart twisted at the sight of him struggling. She couldn't let him get hurt again. Jared lunged, and instinct took over. Nia spun around, yanking Max's leash to pull him behind her. She stood her ground, her chest heaving as she faced Jared. The sheer hatred in his eyes sent a chill down her spine, but she didn't move. Max growled low at her side, baring his teeth as he huddled close. You really thought you could outrun me? Jared sneered, stopping just a few feet away. His chest heaved with exertion, but his voice carried the same cruel arrogance as before. Look at you. Pathetic. You should have just handed over the wallet. Now you're making this harder on yourself. I don't have anything for you. Nia shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. Leave us alone. The police are coming. Jared laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made her stomach churn. The police? He gestured around the deserted path. Where are they? Do you see anyone coming to save you? It's just you, me, and that useless mutt. Max barked sharply, his growl rising as he shifted protectively in front of Nia. Jared's face twisted into a sneer as he pointed at the dog. That thing? You really think it's gonna protect you? One good kick, and it's done. Don't you dare touch him, Nia snapped, her voice rising with anger. Her hands clenched into fists, and she felt the leash bite into her palm. You've done enough. Jared took a step forward, his eyes glinting with malice. Oh, I'm just getting started. You don't get to walk around like you own the place. People like you think you can take whatever you want, but not here. Not today. Stay back, Nia warned, her voice low and firm. Her whole body trembled, but she held her ground. She knew running wasn't an option anymore. Jared wasn't going to stop, and she wasn't about to let him hurt Max, or her, again. Jared smirked, taking another step closer. What are you gonna do, huh? Swing that leash at me? Scream for help? Go ahead. Let's see who's really in charge here. Max barked again, louder this time, the sound echoing with defiance. Jared flinched slightly, his bravado faltering for a split second before his sneer returned. He curled his hands into fists, his posture coiled and ready. Nia's breath steadied as she prepared herself. Her mind raced, weighing her options, but one thing was clear. She wasn't backing down. Not this time. The air between them felt electric, charged with unspoken threats and sheer willpower. Neither moved, locked in a tense standoff as Max's growls filled the silence. Jared's smirk widened as he stood just a step away from Nia, his eyes darting between her and Max. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Nia's heart thudded wildly in her chest. She tightened her grip on Max's leash, her voice trembling as she spoke. Don't do this. Just walk away. Jared scoffed, his expression hardening. Walk away? Nah, you're gonna give me what I want. Hand over that wallet, or I'll make sure your little mutt doesn't walk again. Nia's eyes darted down to Max, who stood firm at her side despite his limp. His growls deepened, his body rigid with protective energy. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. Maybe giving him the wallet would end this. Maybe it would keep Max safe. Her fingers shook as she reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out her wallet. Take it, she said, her voice strained. Just leave us alone. Jared snatched the wallet from her hand, his movements rough and triumphant. He flipped it open and rifled through it, his sneer growing as he pulled out the few bills she had inside. This it? Pathetic. He tossed the empty wallet to the ground and stepped forward again, his eyes dark with malice. Maybe I'll teach you a lesson anyway. That was the moment Max moved. With a sudden lunge, Max leaped at Jared, his teeth flashing as he went for Jared's leg. Jared cursed, stumbling backward as the dog's jaws clamped onto his jeans. Get this stupid dog off me, he yelled, shaking his leg violently to break free. Max, no! Nia cried, her voice cracking with panic. She pulled on the leash, trying to get Max to release, but her loyal companion refused to back down. His growls were feral, his determination unyielding. Jared's rage boiled over. With a brutal motion, he raised his boot and kicked Max hard in the side. The dog yelped in pain, his body crumpling as he hit the ground. "That's what you get!" Jared spat, his face contorted with fury. "Max!" Nia screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as she cradled his trembling body, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, buddy. Stay with me." Jared loomed over her, his chest heaving as if he was ready to lash out again. But before he could move, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. His expression shifted, panic flickering behind his eyes as he glanced around the empty park. "Damn it!" he muttered under his breath. Without another word, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Nia didn't move. Her entire focus was on Max, whose eyes were open but clouded with pain. She whispered softly to him, her tears falling onto his golden fur. "You're gonna be okay, Max. I promise." The sound of sirens grew closer, a bitter-sweet relief washing over her as help finally arrived. Nia knelt on the hard pavement, her hands trembling as they hovered over Max's still body. The familiar warmth of his golden fur beneath her fingers was a stark contrast to the cold, brutal reality of the situation. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each shallow breath pulling at her heartstrings. Tears spilled from her eyes, unbidden and unstoppable, as the enormity of the moment crashed down on her. "Max!" she choked out, her voice cracking as she stroked his head. His soft ears twitched slightly at her touch, but his eyes remained half-closed, clouded with pain. "Max, stay with me, please. You're my boy, my brave boy." Her voice trembled with every word as she cupped his face, trying to keep her own panic from spilling over. "You're the strongest dog I know," she whispered, forcing a small, shaky smile despite the tears streaking her face. "Remember when you tore up that chew toy in 2 minutes flat? I had to order the indestructible ones because nothing could hold up to you." Max's ears flicked faintly at her voice, and she clung to that tiny response as though it was a lifeline. "You're not done being strong, okay?" she continued, her voice soft but firm. "You're not leaving me. Not today. We've got too much to do, too many walks to take, too many squirrels to chase." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and with trembling hands, she fumbled to pull it out. The screen blurred through her tears, but she managed to redial 911. Her breath hitched as the operator picked up, their calm voice a fragile thread of hope in her chaos. 911. "What's your emergency?" "It's my dog," Nia stammered, her voice raw with emotion. "He's been hurt. He needs help." "Please. He's not moving right. I don't know what to do." The operator's voice was steady, a small anchor in the storm. "Officers are arriving now, and animal services are en route. Stay with your dog and keep him calm. Help is on the way." "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. Her focus returned to Max, her fingers gently tracing the fur along his back. He let out a faint whimper, his body trembling as he tried to shift closer to her. "It's okay," she murmured, pressing her forehead to his. "It's okay, buddy. You just have to hold on a little longer. They're coming to help you, I promise." Her tears soaked into his fur, but she didn't care. She whispered to him, her voice a soothing mantra of love and encouragement. "You're my protector, Max. Remember that? Always looking out for me, even when I don't deserve it. And now, it's my turn. I've got you, and I'm not going to let you go." Max's tail moved faintly, a weak flick against the ground that made her breath catch. "There you are," she said, with a watery smile. "That's my boy. You're so brave." "Braver than me!" The distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet park and signaling help was near. Flashing red and blue lights bathed the scene in an otherworldly glow as a police car pulled onto the path, its tires crunching over the gravel. Relief coursed through her, but it did little to dull the ache in her chest. "See, Max? They're here," she whispered, stroking his fur. "They're going to take care of you. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Okay?" An officer stepped out of the car, his face a mixture of urgency and concern. Behind him, an animal services van pulled up, its logo bright and stark in the park's dim light. Nia waved them over with one hand while keeping her other firmly on Max, grounding herself in the connection they shared. "We're going to get through this," she said, her voice steadier now, filled with quiet determination. "You and me, just like always." As the officer approached, she looked back at Max, her tears drying as a fierce resolve settled over her. This wasn't the end. Not for Max, not for her, and not for the man who had done this. Justice would come, but for now, her only focus was Max. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the officer asked, his voice calm but urgent. Nia shook her head quickly, her tears still flowing. "Not me. Him, my dog, Max. He's hurt. He's in so much pain." Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "A man attacked us. He kicked him. Twice. He could barely keep up, and he didn't stop." The officer crouched down beside her, his expression softening as he glanced at Max. "We'll get him help, I promise," he said, pulling out his radio. "Animal Services is right behind me. They'll be here in a second. You said someone attacked you? Did they hurt you at all?" "No," Nia replied quickly, her voice rising in pitch. "He didn't touch me. But Max, he wouldn't stop kicking him. He was so angry, and She cut herself off, choking on the memory. "He ran when he heard the sirens." The officer nodded, his face tightening as he processed her words. "Did you get a good look at him? Can you describe him?" "Yes," she said, her tone sharpening with determination. "White, mid-20s, brown hair, wearing a hoodie. Gray, I think. Jeans, scuffed boots. Her voice wavered, the anger threatening to crack through her control. "He said he'd hurt Max unless I gave him my wallet. I tried to stop him, but when Max went after him, he kicked him so hard." She buried her face in her hands for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. The officer placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief but grounding gesture. "You did everything you could," he said softly. "And you're here for him now. That matters." A van door slammed nearby, and a vet tech jogged over with a stretcher. Nia immediately moved aside, her hands shaking as she gestured to Max. "Please, help him," she pleaded, her voice breaking again. "He's everything to me." The vet tech knelt beside Max, her movements quick but gentle as she assessed his injuries. "He's a fighter," she said with a small smile, glancing at Nia. "We'll take good care of him." "Thank you," Nia whispered, her hands pressed to her chest as she watched them lift Max carefully onto the stretcher. His tail moved faintly again, and it was enough to bring fresh tears to her eyes. The officer stood as the vet tech carried Max to the van, then turned back to Nia. "We'll put out a description of the suspect and start looking for him right away," he said. "Do you want to file a report now, or do you need some time?" Nia's jaw tightened as she wiped at her tears. "No," she said firmly. "I'll do it now. That man isn't getting away with this." The officer nodded, pulling out a notepad. "All right? Let's start at the beginning. You said he approached you in the park. What exactly did he say?" Nia took a shaky breath, glancing at the van where Max was being secured. "He was angry," she began, her voice steadier now. "He said people like me didn't belong here. He wanted my wallet and threatened to hurt Max if I didn't give it to him. And then he did." Her voice faltered, but the officer kept his gaze steady on her. "You did the right thing calling us. We're going to find him," he assured her. "And when we do, he'll face the consequences." Nia nodded slowly, her fists clenched at her sides. "Good," she said, her voice hardening. "Because I'm not letting this go." The officer closed his notepad, giving her a firm nod before stepping back. As he relayed her statement over the radio, Nia stood frozen for a moment, her eyes fixed on the van. She could feel her anger building, simmering beneath the surface. Hours later, the apartment felt unbearably quiet when Nia returned, the absence of Max filling the space with a heavy stillness. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the spot where his bed lay empty. The leash still dangling from her hand, the memory of his whimper, his pained eyes looking up at her, played on a loop in her mind. Each repetition tightening the knot in her chest. The officers had assured her they'd handle it, that they'd find Jared and bring him to justice. But as the hours stretched into the night, her unease only grew. She paced the living room, her footsteps soft against the carpet, her thoughts spiraling into frustration. Waiting wasn't enough. Not for what Jared had done, not for Max. Her gaze fell to the leash again, its sturdy fabric embroidered with Max's name. She traced the letters with her fingers, her jaw tightening as determination sparked in her chest. Max had been there for her through everything. Her protector, her constant companion. Now, it was her turn to protect him, to make sure the man who hurt him didn't get away. She sat down on the edge of the couch, gripping her phone tightly as she scrolled through her contacts. The police had their process, but Nia had someone else in mind. Someone who didn't play by the rules. Her thumb hovered over the name for a moment before pressing it, the dial tone ringing in her ear like a drumbeat. "Hey," a deep, familiar voice answered. "What's going on, Nia?" "It's late, James," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I need your help." The line went quiet for a moment before he spoke again, his tone cautious. "What kind of help?" "It's about Max," she said, the words spilling out. "A man attacked us, hurt him bad. The police are looking for him, but it's not enough. I need to find him, James. I need to make him pay." James sighed, the sound heavy with hesitation. "Nia, this sounds serious. Are you sure you want to do this?" "I've never been more sure of anything," she said, her voice sharpening with resolve. "He can't just walk away from this. He needs to know he messed with the wrong person." "All right," James said, his tone shifting to match hers. "Tell me everything. I'll help you." Nia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her grip on the phone loosening slightly. As she explained what had happened, the fire in her chest burned brighter. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. For Max and for herself. The cafe was dimly lit, its usual hum of conversation and clinking cups muted at this late hour. Nia sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of untouched coffee. The steam curled into the air, unnoticed, as her mind raced through the events of the past few hours. The weight of Max's absence pressed heavily on her chest, and the simmering anger beneath her skin left her restless. Her gaze snapped toward the door every time it opened, and finally, James walked in. James moved with quiet purpose, his tall, broad-shouldered frame and sharp eyes cutting an imposing figure. He wore a leather jacket over a plain black t-shirt, but it was his demeanor that caught attention. Calm, measured, and slightly intimidating. A former Special Forces operative, James had seen and done more than Nia could imagine, but he rarely spoke about it. The quiet intensity he carried was more than enough to tell his story. He spotted her immediately, his concern evident as he approached and slid into the seat across from her. "You look like you've been through the ringer," he said, his voice low and steady. "Feels like it," Nia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks for coming." "Of course." "What's going on?" he asked, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. Nia hesitated for a moment, her hands tightening around the mug. "It's Max," she said finally. "A man attacked us, hurt him badly. The police are looking for him, but it's not enough. I need your help." James studied her for a moment, his dark eyes narrowing. "You're asking me to track someone down?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I can't just sit here and wait while he gets away." James exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "You know what you're asking me, right? This isn't just about finding someone. It's about making sure you're ready for what happens next. Do you know who this guy is? What he's capable of?" "I know enough," Nia replied, her voice sharp. "He's dangerous. He threatened me, hurt Max, and then ran like a coward. He can't get away with this." James nodded, his expression grim. "All right. Tell me everything. And don't leave anything out." Nia launched into the story, describing the walk in the park, Jared's taunts, and the escalating threats. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted how Max had tried to protect her, only to be brutally kicked down. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling, her anger barely contained. "He didn't just hurt Max," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He wanted to hurt me too. Max was just in the way." James's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward again, his gaze steady. "And the police? What are they doing?" "They're trying," Nia said, frustration creeping into her tone. "But you know how these things go. They're overworked, and Jared could disappear before they find him. I need to know he won't get the chance." James was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "He said anything that might give us a clue where to start?" Nia nodded, her brow furrowing as she recalled Jared's words. "He ranted about people like me taking over his neighborhood. He was angry, bitter. He seemed like someone who feels the world owes him something. And now he's blaming everyone else." James tilted his head slightly, his sharp mind already working. "Sounds like a guy with a chip on his shoulder. He's probably not hiding too far from the places he knows best." "Can you help me?" Nia asked, her voice soft but resolute. "You have the skills to find him." James's lips quirked into a faint, humorless smile. "Special Forces wasn't exactly about tracking down petty thugs," he said, though his tone was light. "But yeah, I know how to find someone who doesn't want to be found." "Thank you," Nia said, relief flooding her voice. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," James replied with a faint grin. "But I'll make it easier for you. Here's the deal. We start with the places I know. Bars, run-down spots. Anywhere someone like him might go to blow off steam. But we have to be smart about this. If he gets wind that you're looking for him, he could skip town." "I'll do whatever it takes," Nia said, her resolve hardening. "He's not walking away from this." James leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Then let's get started. I'll make some calls tonight and put out feelers. Tomorrow, we start looking. But Nia, if we do this, you need to stay focused. No losing your head. Understood?" "Understood," she said, her jaw tightening. "Let's make him pay." James stood, grabbing his keys. "Then let's go. The sooner we start, the better." As they left the cafe together, Nia felt a renewed sense of purpose. Jared had made a mistake when he hurt Max, and now she had someone in her corner who wouldn't let him slip through the cracks. Justice was coming, and she wouldn't stop until it was done. The city streets were quiet as Nia and James moved through them, the early morning hours cloaking everything in a soft gray haze. James drove with the kind of precise confidence that came from years of training, his hands steady on the wheel as his eyes flicked between the road and the mirrors. Nia sat beside him, her phone in her lap, and a tension in her chest that refused to ease. "So, here's the plan," James said, breaking the silence. His tone was clipped, professional, as though he were back on a mission. "We start with the places I know. Bars, spots where guys like him blow off steam. If he's local, someone will have seen him. We ask questions, subtly, and see who talks." Nia nodded, clutching Max's leash in her hands like a talisman. "And if no one talks?" James glanced at her, his gaze sharp. "Someone always talks. You just have to know how to ask." The car rolled to a stop outside a dingy bar tucked into a shadowy corner of the city. The neon sign above the door flickered weakly, casting uneven light onto the cracked sidewalk. James killed the engine and turned to her. "Stay close. Let me do most of the talking." "Got it," Nia said, her voice firmer than she felt. They stepped out of the car, the cool air biting against Nia's skin. James led the way, his posture relaxed but purposeful. Inside, the bar smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where anonymity was the only rule. A few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, and a surly bartender wiped down the counter with slow, deliberate movements. James approached the bar, nodding once at the bartender. "Looking for someone," he said, sliding a $50 bill across the counter. "Mid-20s, brown hair, gray hoodie. Name's Jared. Seen him?" The bartender paused, his eyes flicking to the bill before narrowing at James. What's it to you? James leaned in slightly, his voice low and firm. Just need to talk to him. He caused some trouble for a friend of mine, and I'd rather settle it quietly. The bartender snorted, but pocketed the money. Saw someone like that a couple of nights ago. Loud, drunk, mouthing off about people moving into his neighborhood. Fits your description. Where'd he go? James pressed. Don't know. Said something about crashing with a buddy. Guy named Mike, I think. Lives in the old industrial district. James nodded, straightening. Appreciate it. They left the bar quickly, and as they stepped back into the cold air, Nia turned to him, her brow furrowed. Do you really think this Mike guy will know where he is? It's a lead, James said, unlocking the car. And when you're tracking someone, you follow every lead. As they drove toward the industrial district, Nia felt her anxiety start to morph into determination. The thought of Jared hiding, thinking he was untouchable, only strengthened her resolve. When we find him, she said, her voice quiet but firm, I want to be the one to confront him. James glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You'll get your chance, he said. But you have to stay calm. If you lose control, he'll use it against you. I won't lose control, Nia said, gripping the leash tighter. Not this time. James nodded, and silence filled the car once more. Outside, the city began to wake. But for Nia, the world had narrowed to one singular goal, finding Jared and making sure he answered for what he'd done. The industrial district was a maze of crumbling warehouses and graffiti-streaked walls. The early morning light filtered through gaps in the buildings, casting long shadows across the uneven streets. James parked the car at the edge of the district, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the practiced precision of someone who had trained for situations like this. This is the kind of place where people disappear, James muttered as he stepped out of the car. Stay sharp. Nia followed, her steps measured but purposeful. She clutched Max's leash in her pocket, its familiar texture grounding her as her nerves hummed with anticipation. The thought of Jared hiding in this labyrinth of decay, smug and untouchable, only fueled her determination. James gestured toward a cluster of run-down buildings. If this Mike guy is here, he'll be in one of these spots. We'll split up, circle around, look for signs of movement. But keep your distance. If you see anything, call me immediately. Nia hesitated. Are you sure splitting up is a good idea? James gave her a steady look. I'll be close. This is just faster. Trust me. She nodded reluctantly, and they moved in opposite directions, weaving through the alleys and peering into darkened doorways. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust, the silence punctuated by the distant clatter of shifting metal. Nia's pulse quickened as she rounded a corner and spotted a man slumped against the wall, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His hoodie was faded, his face weathered and unshaven, but her stomach twisted as she recognized him from the bartender's description. Mike, she whispered to herself. The man's head snapped up, his bleary eyes narrowing as he noticed her. What do you want? He barked, his voice rough. Nia steadied herself, taking a cautious step forward. I'm looking for Jared. I heard he might be staying with you. Mike snorted, his lips curling into a sneer. What's it to you? He attacked my dog, Nia said, her voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength. I need to find him. Mike chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Figures. Jared always did have a way of stirring up trouble, but you're wasting your time. He's not here. Then where is he? She pressed, her fists clenching at her sides. I need to know. Mike took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Even if I knew, why would I tell you? You think you can just walk in here and demand answers? Before Nia could respond, James appeared behind her, his presence commanding as he stepped forward. She's not alone, he said evenly, his voice carrying an edge that made Mike freeze. And if you know where Jared is, you're going to tell us. Mike's bravado faltered as he glanced between them, his cigarette trembling slightly in his fingers. Look, I don't want any trouble, he muttered. Jared mentioned crashing at an old storage unit on the East End. That's all I know. James nodded, his gaze hard. Good. I'd suggest you keep it that way. Mike muttered something under his breath, retreating into the shadows as James turned to Nia. Come on, let's move. As they headed toward the east end of the district, Nia's heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. They were getting closer. She could feel it, and with every step, her resolve hardened. Jared wasn't going to get away. Not this time. The storage units loomed ahead. A cluster of rusted, weather-beaten structures surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken pavement. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint metallic tang of decay. Nia followed James closely, her pulse hammering in her ears as they approached the units. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel under their feet. James held up a hand, signaling her to stop. "Stay back for now," he said in a low voice. "I'll check the area first." Nia frowned but nodded, watching as James moved forward with a quiet precision that reminded her of the training he rarely talked about. He scanned the row of units, his sharp eyes flicking from door to door, looking for any sign of recent activity. After a moment, he motioned her to follow. "There," he whispered, pointing to one of the units. The padlock on the door hung loose, as though hastily secured. A faint scuff mark in the dirt near the entrance caught his attention, and he crouched down to examine it. "He's been here recently," James said, his voice barely audible. "The door's not locked properly, and those marks look fresh." Nia's heart raced as she stepped closer, her body trembling with anticipation. "So what do we do now?" James straightened, his expression calm but intense. "We go in, but carefully. Stay behind me, and don't do anything until I say so." She hesitated for a moment, the weight of what they were about to do pressing heavily on her. But then the image of Max flashed in her mind, his crumpled body, his pained whimpers, and any doubt she felt evaporated. "Okay," she said firmly. James approached the door, his movements deliberate and silent. He tested the handle and with a sharp motion pushed it open. The creak of the hinges echoed in the stillness, and he stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit space. The unit was cluttered with old furniture and discarded junk, but it was the figure slouched on a mattress in the corner that drew their attention. Jared. His hoodie was rumpled, and a half-empty bottle of beer rested near his hand. He looked up groggily, his eyes narrowing as he registered their presence. "What the hell?" Jared slurred, struggling to sit up. "Who are you?" Nia stepped into the doorway, her hands clenched into fists. "You know who I am," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "You attacked me and my dog. Did you think I'd let you get away with it?" Recognition flickered in Jared's eyes, and his face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, it's you," he said, his tone mocking. "What? You brought backup? Couldn't handle me on your own?" James moved forward, his towering presence silencing Jared's bravado for a moment. "You've got two choices," he said evenly. "You can come quietly, or this gets messy." Jared snorted, his confidence returning as he leaned back against the wall. "You think you can scare me? I don't owe you anything." Nia's voice rose, her anger bubbling to the surface. "You owe Max. You owe me. You're not getting out of this." Jared laughed bitterly. "That stupid mutt. He got in my way, just like you people always do." The words sent a wave of fury through Nia, but before she could respond, James stepped between them. "Enough," he said, his tone cold. "You're done talking." The room seemed to shrink as the tension thickened, the air heavy with the weight of the confrontation. Jared shifted, his eyes darting toward the open door as if calculating his chances of escape. James noticed the movement immediately, his body tensing. "Don't even think about it," James warned. For a moment, Jared froze, his bravado faltering. But then his lips curled into a defiant grin, and he made a sudden move toward the door. James was faster, intercepting him with a swift, practiced motion that sent Jared stumbling back onto the mattress. "Stay down," James growled, his voice a low rumble. Nia stepped forward, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and determination. "You're not running this time, Jared. The police are on their way, and you're going to pay for what you did." The tension in the air snapped as Jared pushed himself off the mattress with sudden force. His movements were clumsy, but fueled by desperation, and his sneer returned as he squared off against James. You think you can come in here and play hero? He spat, his voice laced with venom. Let's see how tough you really are. James didn't flinch. His stance shifted slightly, his body poised with the calm confidence of someone who'd faced far worse. You don't want to do this, he said coldly. Jared lunged forward, swinging wildly. James dodged the first blow easily, sidestepping and grabbing Jared's wrist. He twisted it sharply, forcing a grunt of pain from Jared as he stumbled. "Stay down," James growled, his voice hard and unyielding. But Jared wasn't done. He ripped his arm free with a violent jerk and stumbled back. His eyes darted around the cluttered storage unit, locking on a broken chair leg leaning against the wall. Snatching it up, he brandished it like a weapon, a sneer twisting his bloodied face. "You think you're better than me?" Jared snarled, advancing with the chair leg raised. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "Put it down," James warned, his voice like ice. "You're only making this worse." "Shut up!" Jared roared, swinging the chair leg with all his strength. James deflected the first swing, the wood splintering as it struck a nearby shelf. The second came faster, but James caught it mid-air, wrenching it from Jared's hands and tossing it aside. Nia stood near the doorway, her chest heaving as she watched the chaotic fight unfold. Her knuckles whitened as she clenched her fists, every fiber of her being screaming for her to act. The memory of Max lying helpless on the ground burned in her mind, fueling her anger. Jared swung again with his fists, desperation making him sloppy. James sidestepped, landing a precise blow to Jared's midsection, sending him staggering back. Jared's body slammed into the wall, his lips split and bleeding, but his rage remained unbroken. "You think you've won?" Jared sneered, wiping blood from his mouth. "You're nothing." James started to step forward, but Nia's voice rang out, sharp and furious. "Stop holding back!" Both men turned to her, startled. Without hesitation, Nia stormed forward, her fury bubbling to the surface. Jared straightened, his sneer returning. "What? You want a piece of this too? You have no idea," Nia snapped. She grabbed the broken chair leg James had tossed aside, her grip tightening as she advanced. Her heart pounded, but the thought of Max's pained whimpers gave her all the courage she needed. Jared laughed bitterly, but the sound died in his throat as Nia swung the chair leg with a force that shocked even her. The blunt edge connected with his side, and he let out a choked yell, stumbling to the floor. "You kicked my dog," Nia hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You threatened me, and you thought you'd get away with it." Jared scrambled backward. But Nia didn't let up. She threw the chair leg aside and grabbed his hoodie, pulling him halfway up before shoving him back down with all her strength. "You don't get to hurt Max and walk away," she spat, her fists shaking. James moved beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Nia, that's enough," he said softly, his voice grounding her. "He's done." The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as red and blue lights began to dance across the walls. Nia's chest heaved as she looked down at Jared, his defiant sneer replaced by fear and exhaustion. "You thought you could hurt us," she said, her voice steel-edged. "But you were wrong." James hauled Jared to his feet, locking his arms behind his back. "You're finished," he said, his tone calm but deadly serious. Jared squirmed, but the fight had left him. As the police stormed into the storage unit, Nia stepped back, her hands shaking but her resolve unbroken. Justice was here, and she had played her part. The wail of sirens grew deafening as the police cars screeched to a halt outside the storage unit. Flashing red and blue lights bathed the walls in an eerie glow, illuminating the tense scene within. Nia took a step back, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. James still held Jared firmly, pinning his arms behind his back as the man struggled weakly. Two officers burst into the unit, their hands on their holsters. Their sharp eyes took in the disarray, the broken chair leg, the toppled furniture, and Jared's bloodied face. One of the officers stepped forward, his gaze locking on James. "Drop him. Hands where I can see them." James nodded calmly and released Jared, raising his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "He's the one you're looking for," James said evenly, gesturing toward Jared. "Jared Owens. He assaulted her," he motioned to Nia, "and her dog." Jared stumbled forward, holding his ribs with one hand, his expression a mix of fury and fear. "They attacked me!" he shouted hoarsely, trying to straighten. "This is a setup. I didn't do anything." The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You want to save it for the station? Or should I start listing the charges right now?" Nia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fire burning in her chest. "He kicked my dog, twice. He threatened me, stole from me, and ran when the police showed up. He deserves everything coming to him." The officer nodded at her, his tone softening. "We'll take your statement, ma'am. You did the right thing calling us." The second officer approached Jared, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Jared's bravado cracked as the metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. "You're making a mistake," he spat, his voice rising. "This isn't over." The officer tightened the cuffs and patted Jared down before hauling him toward the door. "It is over," he said flatly. "You're under arrest for assault, theft, and animal cruelty. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Jared was dragged outside, his protests faded into the hum of activity around them. Another officer approached Nia, holding a small notepad. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come to the station and provide a full statement. Can you do that?" "Yes," Nia said firmly, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her voice was steady now, a reflection of the resolve she felt. "I want to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." James stepped beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We'll go together," he said. "You're not doing this alone," the officer nodded. "Good. We'll also need the medical records for your dog to complete the report. Animal Services will coordinate with us." Nia's throat tightened at the mention of Max, but she nodded quickly. "I'll get everything you need." As they stepped outside, the weight of the night seemed to settle over her. The storage unit felt a world away now, and the sight of Jared being pushed into the back of a squad car brought a flicker of satisfaction. He glared at her through the window, but she met his gaze with steel in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. As the police cars pulled away, James turned to her. "You did it, Nia. He's in custody. This is just the beginning," she said, her voice resolute. "He needs to face real consequences, for Max and for everyone he's hurt." James nodded. "Then we'll see it through, every step of the way." The two of them stood in the quiet aftermath, the flashing lights receding into the distance. Nia clenched her fists, the fire in her chest now focused into a clear, unshakable purpose. Jared might have thought he was untouchable, but he was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars faded into the distance as Nia and James stood in the empty lot, the weight of the night pressing heavily on them. The officers had left with Jared in custody, and for the first time since the attack, Nia felt a small sense of relief. But it wasn't over. Not yet. She still needed to give her statement at the station to ensure Jared couldn't slip through the cracks. James glanced at her, his voice breaking the silence. "The station's waiting for us. You ready?" Nia hesitated, her fingers tightening around Max's leash. "Not yet," she said softly. "I need to see Max first. I need to know he's okay." James studied her for a moment before nodding. "I'll take you to the hospital first. The statement can wait a little longer." They climbed into the car, the hum of the engine filling the quiet, as they drove through the city streets. The animal hospital wasn't far, but every minute felt stretched thin as Nia's thoughts spiraled. She replayed the confrontation, Jared's taunts, and Max's pained yelp over and over in her mind. The leash in her hands felt like an anchor, grounding her to the memory of him. When they arrived, James parked by the entrance and gave her a reassuring look. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be right here." Nia nodded and stepped into the hospital, the fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell immediately enveloping her. The receptionist at the front desk offered a sympathetic smile. "He's resting in room 3. Dr. Patel is waiting for you." "Thank you," Nia said, her voice soft but steady. She made her way down the corridor, each step heavier than the last. The weight of the evening pressed down on her, but as she reached the door to room 3, she inhaled deeply, steeling herself. When she pushed open the door, her breath caught. Max lay on a soft bed in the corner, his side wrapped in clean white bandages. His golden fur was duller than usual, and he looked smaller somehow, but his tail wagged weakly the moment he saw her. "Max," Nia whispered, tears springing to her eyes as she hurried to his side. She knelt beside him, running her fingers gently through his fur. "Hey, buddy, I'm here." Max let out a soft whine, his head nudging against her hand. The connection they shared was immediate, and for a moment, the world outside faded away. Nia felt the tension in her chest release slightly as she leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. "You're so strong," she murmured. "You've always been my brave boy, Doctor." Patel entered the room quietly, her kind eyes scanning the scene before speaking. "He's stable and doing well, considering what he's been through. The bruising on his ribs is severe, but there's no internal damage. He'll need rest, but I'm optimistic about his recovery." Nia looked up, relief flooding her face. "Thank you. I was so scared." "I know," Dr. Patel said gently, "but you got him here in time. He's lucky to have you." Nia turned her attention back to Max, her fingers brushing over his bandages. "No," she said softly. "I'm the lucky one." Max's tail wagged a little harder, and she laughed through her tears, her voice trembling. "See? Even after everything, you're still wagging that tail. You're incredible." Dr. Patel gave her a reassuring smile. "Spend as much time as you need with him. Just keep his movements minimal for now. He needs rest." "Thank you," Nia said again, her voice full of gratitude. She sat with Max for a few more minutes, stroking his fur and whispering softly to him. She told him about Jared's arrest, about how he wouldn't hurt anyone else again. Max's eyes seemed to brighten slightly, and she liked to believe he understood. Finally, James appeared in the doorway, his presence quiet but grounding. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low. Nia nodded, wiping her eyes and pressing a gentle kiss to Max's head. "I'll be back soon," she promised him. "You just focus on getting better, okay?" Max gave her hand a soft lick, and it was all the reassurance she needed. As she stood, she felt a renewed sense of determination settle over her. Jared might have hurt Max, but he hadn't broken him, and now it was her turn to make sure Jared paid for every ounce of pain he'd caused. As she exited the hospital and climbed back into James's car, she let out a slow breath. James started the engine, glancing at her. "How's he doing?" "He's going to be okay," Nia said, her voice resolute. "He's stronger than I could have imagined." James nodded, pulling onto the street. "Good. Now, let's make sure Jared doesn't have any way out of this." Nia tightened her grip on the leash, the memory of Max's wagging tail fresh in her mind. "Let's make sure of it." The city lights streaked past as they headed toward the station, Nia bracing herself for the next step in her fight for justice. The station was cold and sterile, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a clinical glow over the gray walls and worn linoleum floor. Nia sat in a hard plastic chair, the leash still clutched tightly in her hand. A reminder of Max's resilience. James stood nearby, leaning casually against the wall, but his sharp eyes scanned the room, always assessing. An officer approached with a clipboard, his expression professional but kind. "Ms. Carter, we're ready to take your statement now." Nia nodded, rising to her feet. "I'm ready." The officer led her down a narrow hallway to a small interview room. The walls were bare, save for a clock ticking steadily above the door. A recording device sat in the center of the table, its red light blinking softly. "This is just standard procedure," the officer explained, gesturing for her to take a seat. "We'll go over everything you remember, step by step." Nia sat down, folding her hands in her lap to steady herself. "I want to make sure he doesn't get away with this," she said firmly. "I'll tell you everything." The officer nodded, turning on the recording device. "Let's start from the beginning. Walk me through what happened in the park." Nia recounted the events with as much detail as she could, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memories. She described Jared's taunts, the way he'd cornered her and threatened Max, her hands clenched into fists as she spoke of Max's bravery, how he had tried to protect her, only to be brutally kicked down. The officer listened intently, occasionally jotting notes on the clipboard. When the police arrived at the storage unit, the officer prompted, "Can you describe what happened there?" Nia took a deep breath. "James and I confronted Jared. He tried to fight back, but we stopped him. He said things, hateful things, even after everything he'd done. He didn't show any remorse. When you arrived, he was still trying to act like he'd done nothing wrong." The officer's pen paused for a moment, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "And you're willing to testify to all of this in court?" "Yes," Nia said without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he's held accountable." The officer nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You're doing the right thing, Ms. Carter. We have enough to charge him with assault, theft, and animal cruelty. The evidence you've provided, along with your testimony, will make a strong case." Nia's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the weight of the ordeal still hung heavy. "How long until it goes to trial?" she asked. "That depends," the officer admitted. "The wheels of justice can turn slowly. But with charges like this, it should move quickly. You'll be contacted by the prosecutor's office soon." James leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "We'll make sure she's ready." The officer gave a small nod of approval. "Good. We'll be in touch." As Nia and James left the interview room, the chill of the station seemed to recede slightly. Outside, the city was still awake, its hum of activity a reminder that life moved forward, even after nights like this. "Feel better?" James asked, as they stepped into the night air. "A little," Nia admitted. "But it's not over yet. Jared's still out there, thinking he can win. I need to see this through." "And you will," James said firmly. "We'll make sure of it." Nia looked at the leash in her hand, her resolve hardening. "For Max," she said softly. "For us." As they climbed into the car and drove away, Nia felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't alone. Jared would face justice, and she would be there every step of the way. The days following Jared's arrest passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. Nia sat in the prosecutor's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she listened to Ellen Morris, the sharp-eyed assistant district attorney assigned to the case. Ellen was in her late 30s, with a calm yet commanding presence that put Nia at ease despite the daunting task ahead. "This is a strong case," Ellen began, sliding a folder across the desk toward Nia. "We have your testimony, the police reports, and the veterinary records for Max. Combined, they paint a clear picture of Jared Owens's actions and his intent." Nia opened the folder, her stomach tightening as she saw photos of Max's injuries alongside a written report from Dr. Patel. The bruises on his ribs, the swelling, the way he'd struggled to breathe. It all came rushing back, stoking the anger she'd tried to keep in check. "But a trial isn't just about evidence," Ellen continued. "The defense will try to discredit you, paint Jared as a victim of circumstance, or argue that the injuries to Max aren't as severe as they seem. We need to be ready for anything." James, seated beside Nia, leaned forward. "What's the strategy? How do we shut that down?" Ellen nodded, pulling out a legal pad filled with notes. "First, we'll focus on establishing a timeline. Nia, your testimony will be crucial here. You'll describe the events in the park, the theft, the threats, and how Jared escalated to physical violence. We'll use the vet's testimony to corroborate the extent of Max's injuries." "What about Jared's past?" James asked. "Does he have a record?" Ellen's lips pressed into a thin line. "He does. A history of minor offenses, bar fights, public disturbances. Nothing major, but it establishes a pattern of aggression. We'll use it to show that his actions were deliberate, not a one-off mistake." Nia took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. "What about what he said in the storage unit? The things about people like me?" Ellen's gaze sharpened. "We'll include that. It speaks to motive. His hostility wasn't random. It was targeted, but we need to be careful how we present it to the jury. We want them to focus on the facts, not just the emotions." Nia nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the folder. "I'll do whatever it takes. I want the jury to understand what kind of person he is." "You're doing more than that," Ellen said, her tone softening. You're standing up for what's right. That's not easy, but it matters." As the meeting continued, Ellen walked them through the trial process, from opening statements to cross-examinations. Nia's nerves ebbed and flowed as the reality of the situation sank in, but James's steady presence beside her helped anchor her. He asked pointed questions, ensuring they understood every aspect of the strategy. When the meeting ended, Ellen gave Nia an encouraging smile. "We'll be in touch to finalize everything before the trial." "You're doing great, Nia. Keep that strength." Nia thanked her, her voice steadier than she felt, and left the office with James. Outside, the cool air wrapped around her, a welcome reprieve from the intensity of the discussion. She clutched Max's leash tightly in her hand, her resolve firm. "You're ready for this," James said, his voice calm and sure. "Jared doesn't stand a chance." "I have to be," Nia replied, her jaw tightening. "For Max, for myself, for anyone he thought he could hurt." As they walked toward the car, Nia felt a sense of purpose solidify within her. The trial was coming, and she would be ready. Jared had underestimated her before, but he wouldn't do so again. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the chaos Nia had endured in the days following the attack. Its polished wooden benches and high ceilings seemed designed to exude order, but the tension in the air was palpable. Nia sat at the prosecution's table, her hands resting on Max's leash, which she had brought with her for strength. James sat behind her in the gallery, his quiet presence a constant reassurance. Ellen Morris stood at the front of the courtroom, her voice clear and confident as she delivered the opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about accountability. On that fateful evening, Jared Owens didn't just hurt a dog, he attacked trust, safety, and dignity. The evidence will show that his actions were not only reckless, but intentional, and we ask you to hold him responsible." Nia watched the jury's faces, searching for any sign of empathy or understanding. Some nodded slightly, while others remained impassive, their focus shifting between Ellen and Jared, who sat stiffly at the defense table. His lawyer, a wiry man with sharp eyes, scribbled notes, but gave no indication of his strategy. When it was time for Nia to testify, her pulse quickened as she stood and walked to the witness stand. She took the oath, her hand trembling slightly as she raised it. Settling into the chair, she glanced at Ellen, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Ms. Carter," Ellen began, her tone warm but professional, "can you tell the court what happened on the evening of the incident?" Nia recounted the events in vivid detail, her voice steady despite the flood of emotions. She described the peaceful walk with Max, Jared's taunts, the escalating threats, and the moment he had attacked her dog. Her voice faltered briefly when she spoke of Max's yelp. The sound etched into her memory, but she pressed on. "Why didn't you just walk away?" Ellen asked gently. "I tried," Nia replied, her gaze unwavering, "but he blocked my path. He wasn't just threatening me, he was trying to humiliate me, to make me feel like I didn't belong. And when Max tried to protect me, Jared took his anger out on him." Ellen stepped closer. "And how has this affected you and Max since that day?" Nia took a deep breath. "Max is healing. But it's been hard. He's always been my protector, my best friend. Seeing him hurt like that, knowing someone could be so cruel, it's something I'll never forget. I'm here today because I want to make sure Jared Owens doesn't do this to anyone else." Ellen nodded, her expression one of quiet respect. "Thank you, Ms. Carter." As Ellen returned to her seat, Jared's lawyer rose, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand. "Ms. Carter," he began smoothly, "you seem very emotional about this incident. Isn't it possible that you overreacted, misinterpreted Mr. Owens's intentions?" Nia's jaw tightened, but she held her composure. "No. He made his intentions very clear. He threatened me, and he hurt Max. There was nothing to misinterpret." The lawyer smirked slightly, as though he had expected her answer. "You claim he threatened you, but did he ever physically harm you? Isn't it true that you and your companion escalated the situation by pursuing him later?" James shifted slightly in his seat, but Nia didn't waver. "We didn't escalate anything," she said firmly. "We stood up to him, because he thought he could get away with what he did, and I wasn't going to let that happen." The lawyer raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Nia stepped down from the stand, her legs trembled slightly, but her resolve remained unbroken. She returned to her seat, her eyes meeting James's in the gallery. He gave her a small nod, and she felt a flicker of strength return. The trial was far from over, but she had told her truth. Now, it was up to the court to decide. The defense wasted no time presenting their case. Jared's attorney, Mr. Finch, exuded a practiced confidence as he stepped in front of the jury. His crisp suit and smooth tone contrasted sharply with the simmering tension in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Finch began, gesturing toward Jared, who sat stiffly at the defense table, "this case is not as straightforward as the prosecution would have you believe. My client, Mr. Owens, has been painted as a monster, but I urge you to look beyond the surface. Ask yourselves, was this truly a deliberate act of cruelty, or a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control?" Nia clenched her fists beneath the table, her nails biting into her palms. Finch's words were slick and manipulative, but she kept her gaze steady, refusing to show any reaction. The defense called their first witness, a former co-worker of Jared's, a man in his late 30s with a nervous demeanor. He spoke haltingly, claiming Jared had always been a little rough around the edges, but wasn't a bad guy. "Jared's had a tough life," the man said, shifting in his seat. "Lost his job, his home. Sometimes he gets angry, but who wouldn't?" "Thank you," Finch said, offering the man a kind smile. "No further questions." Ellen's cross-examination was swift. "You say Mr. Owens gets angry. Has he ever directed that anger at you or others?" The witness hesitated. "Well, not me personally, but I've seen him lose his temper. A few arguments at work. Nothing serious." "And did these arguments ever escalate to physical violence?" Ellen pressed. The man faltered, his gaze darting to Jared. "I guess there were a couple of times he got physical. But that's not the same as what you're saying happened here." Ellen nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for clarifying." Next, Finch called Jared to the stand. He walked with an air of defiance, though the bruises from his fight with James were still faintly visible. Sitting stiffly, he avoided Nia's gaze as he answered Finch's questions. "Mr. Owens," Finch began, "can you tell the court what happened that evening from your perspective?" Jared leaned into the microphone, his voice feigning calm. "I was walking through the park, minding my business. She," he jabbed a finger in Nia's direction, "came out of nowhere, yelling at me. Her dog started barking and growling, and I panicked. I didn't mean to hurt the dog, but it was aggressive." Finch nodded sympathetically. "So, you felt threatened?" "Yeah," Jared said, his voice growing louder. "That dog was coming at me. I just reacted." Nia's anger flared, but Ellen placed a calming hand on her arm. "Let him dig his own hole," she whispered. "Did you steal anything from Ms. Carter?" Finch continued. "No," Jared said firmly. "I don't even know what she's talking about. She made that up to make me look bad." Finch smiled. "No further questions." Ellen rose, her movements deliberate as she approached the stand. "Mr. Owens," she began, her voice cool, "you claim you felt threatened by Max. Did you report this supposed aggressive dog to anyone? Animal control? The police?" Jared shifted in his seat, his confidence wavering. "No, but—" "And you said you didn't steal from Ms. Carter," Ellen interrupted. "Then why did she describe you running off with her wallet?" "That didn't happen," Jared snapped. "She's lying." Ellen raised an eyebrow, her expression sharp. "And yet, the police recovered her wallet from your storage unit. Care to explain how it got there?" Jared's mouth opened and closed, his face reddening. I don't know. Maybe she planted it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and the judge's gavel rapped sharply. "Order!" Ellen stepped closer, her voice cutting. "So, according to you, Ms. Carter is a liar, her dog is aggressive, and the police evidence is fabricated? Convenient." Jared glared at her, but said nothing. Ellen turned to the jury, her expression calm but pointed. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Jared returned to his seat, his earlier bravado cracked and exposed. Nia felt a flicker of satisfaction. He was unraveling. But the trial wasn't over yet, and the stakes were too high to celebrate early. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was electric with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the soft murmur of spectators barely masking the gravity of what was about to happen. Nia sat at the prosecution's table, her hands resting on Max's leash. She didn't take her eyes off Ellen Morris, who stood confidently in front of the jury, ready to deliver her closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ellen began, her voice steady and clear, "this case is about responsibility. Jared Owens made a series of deliberate choices on the evening in question. He chose to approach Ms. Carter and her dog. He chose to threaten her, to harm her dog, and to steal from her. These actions were not accidental. They were deliberate, malicious, and entirely avoidable." Ellen paced slowly, her gaze sweeping across the jury. "The defense would have you believe this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Owens acted out of fear. But let's consider the facts. Ms. Carter's testimony was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by physical evidence. The stolen wallet recovered from the defendant's possession. Dr. Patel's records confirm the severity of Max's injuries, which were not the result of a simple misstep, but a deliberate act of cruelty." Ellen stopped, her eyes locking on the jury. "And then there are Mr. Owens's own words. His hostility, his lack of remorse, his refusal to take accountability. This isn't about an overreaction. It's about a pattern of behavior. A pattern that led to this violent act." She gestured toward Nia, her voice softening slightly. "Ms. Carter came here not for revenge, but for justice. She has shown courage and resolve in standing up for herself and her dog, ensuring that someone who thinks they can act with impunity is held accountable. We ask you to do the same." Ellen returned to the prosecution's table, her steps measured. "This is your chance to send a message, to show that actions like Mr. Owens's have consequences. I trust you'll do the right thing." The jury's expressions were unreadable, but Nia felt a flicker of hope as Ellen sat down beside her. "You did amazing," Nia whispered. Ellen gave her a small smile. "Now, we wait." Finch stood next, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury. His tone was smooth, almost conversational. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot of emotional testimony over the past few days, and while my heart goes out to Ms. Carter and her dog, I urge you to consider the possibility that emotions have clouded this case." He gestured toward Jared, who sat rigidly at the defense table. "Mr. Owens has admitted to making mistakes. He's not perfect, but who among us is? The prosecution wants you to believe he's some kind of monster, but the evidence shows otherwise. There's reasonable doubt here. Doubt about his intent, doubt about the events as described by Ms. Carter, and doubt about whether this was truly a crime or an unfortunate misunderstanding." Finch's closing argument was smooth, but Nia couldn't shake the hollowness of his words. She glanced at the jury, trying to gauge their reactions, but their faces remained neutral. When Finch returned to his seat, the judge instructed the jury to deliberate. Nia's stomach churned as they filed out of the courtroom, their expressions giving nothing away. James leaned forward from the gallery, his voice low. "You did everything you could. Now it's up to them." Nia nodded, gripping the leash tightly. "I just want him to pay for what he did." As the courtroom emptied, the tension in the air grew heavier. The waiting would be excruciating, but Nia reminded herself that she had done her part. Now, all she could do was hope. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in, their expressions still unreadable. Nia's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers clutching Max's leash so tightly that her knuckles turned white. James sat behind her, his steady presence grounding her as the judge called for order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his tone formal and measured. A middle-aged woman in the front row of the jury stood, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. "We have, Your Honor." Nia held her breath, her gaze locked on the woman as she unfolded the paper and began to read. "In the case of Jared Owens, We find the defendant guilty on all counts: assault, theft, and animal cruelty. A wave of relief crashed over Nia, and she exhaled shakily. Her grip on Max's leash loosened as her shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. Jared, however, erupted from his seat, his face red with fury. "This is bull!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You're all against me! This isn't justice!" The judge's gavel rapped sharply, silencing him. "Mr. Owens, sit down, or you will be removed from the courtroom." Jared slumped back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Nia refused to look at him, her focus remaining on the judge as he turned his attention to the sentencing. "Mr. Owens," the judge began, his tone stern, "your actions were deliberate, malicious, and without provocation. You not only caused physical harm to an innocent animal, but also instilled fear and trauma in Ms. Carter. Such behavior is unacceptable, and it is the duty of this court to ensure you face the appropriate consequences." The judge paused, his gaze piercing. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for assault and theft, with an additional 3 years for animal cruelty, to be served consecutively. You will also be required to pay restitution for Mrs. Carter's veterinary expenses and any related damages." Jared's face twisted in disbelief as the sentence was handed down. 8 years? For a dog? He spat, his voice dripping with contempt. The judge's gavel came down again, his expression unyielding. "Court is adjourned." As the courtroom began to clear, Nia remained seated, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, exhaustion, and lingering anger. James leaned forward, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "It's over." Nia turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "For Max," she said softly. "He deserved justice." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, their cameras flashing as Nia and James emerged. Ellen joined them briefly, her expression professional but warm. "You were incredible, Nia. Your courage made this happen." "Thank you," Nia said, her voice steady. "I just hope this sends a message." As she walked away from the chaos of the crowd, Max's leash still in her hand, Nia felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. Jared was behind bars, and while it wouldn't undo the harm he had caused, it meant he couldn't hurt anyone else. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The road to healing would be long, but she knew one thing for certain: she and Max would walk it together. The sun was setting as Nia pulled into the driveway of her quiet suburban home, the warm orange glow casting long shadows across the yard. The passenger seat was occupied by Max, his golden fur shining in the light. He stretched lazily as Nia turned off the engine, his tail thumping against the seat with quiet excitement. It had been a long road to this moment. Weeks of vet visits, careful monitoring, and slow walks to rebuild his strength had finally paid off. Max had been cleared to come home that morning, and Nia had spent the entire day preparing the house. His favorite bed freshly washed, new toys waiting for him, and even a small sign on the porch that read, "Welcome home, Max." "We're home, buddy," she said, her voice soft with emotion. She reached over to scratch behind his ears, her fingers brushing the faint scar along his side. "Ready to see your kingdom?" Max let out a happy bark, his bright eyes meeting hers with unbridled trust. She opened the car door, and he hopped out carefully, his movements still measured but confident. He sniffed the air, taking in the familiar sense of home before trotting toward the porch. The sight brought tears to Nia's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. The trial, the sleepless nights, the overwhelming worry, all of it had been worth it to see Max like this, happy and whole again. Jared was behind bars where he belonged, and the weight of those dark weeks was finally lifting. She grabbed his leash out of habit, but let it hang loosely in her hand as Max explored the yard. "Go ahead," she said with a smile, waving him toward the grass. "You're free." Max bounded forward, sniffing every corner of the yard before rolling onto his back in the grass, his legs kicking playfully in the air. Nia laughed, sitting down on the porch steps to watch him. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly at peace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention away. It was a text from James. "How's the big guy settling in?" She smiled as she typed back, "He's perfect. The yard is officially Max's again." James's reply came almost instantly. "Good. Don't forget, I owe him a steak dinner for being the bravest dog I know. Let me know when he's ready to cash in." Nia chuckled, tucking her phone away and turning her attention back to Max. He was chasing a butterfly across the yard, his movements lighter than they had been in weeks. It was such a small thing, but it meant the world to her. A reminder that life could be beautiful, even after the darkest storms. "Max!" she called, and he bounded over, his tongue lolling happily. She wrapped her arms around him as he sat beside her, burying her face in his fur. "We did it, buddy. He can't hurt us anymore." Max wagged his tail furiously, giving her an enthusiastic lick on the cheek. She laughed, wiping her face. Okay, I get it. Let's go inside. You've got a surprise waiting for you." As they stepped into the house together, Max's tail wagged even harder at the sight of his favorite bed, his new toys, and the treats she had set on the counter. Nia smiled, her heart full as she closed the door behind them. The future wasn't certain, but one thing was, she and Max would face it together, stronger and closer than ever. And for now, that was more than enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.